The central premise of this transmission is not that the human body is flawed, deficient, or incomplete, but that it is an extraordinarily intelligent biological system equipped with internal mechanisms of regulation, repair, and restoration that have existed since birth and long before language medicine or modern science attempted to define them. What is being addressed here is not the introduction of a new ability or an exotic technique, but the remembrance of an intrinsic capacity that has been progressively ignored, suppressed, or overridden by a civilization conditioned to seek authority outside itself. Ancient wisdom traditions across cultures understood the body not as a machine to be fixed, but as a living, responsive intelligence that continuously seeks equilibrium when provided with the correct internal conditions. Modern neuroscience, through the study of the autonomic nervous system, neuroplasticity, and embodied regulation, is now validating this understanding not by invoking mysticism, but by mapping the exact biological pathways through which calm, clarity, and repair are initiated within the human organism. This convergence marks a critical moment, not because something new has been discovered, but because something ancient is being remembered in modern language. The error of the modern world has not been ignorance, but amnesia. The forgetting that the body is not subordinate to the mind, nor is it a passive object awaiting external correction, but a sovereign system capable of self-healing when it is no longer trapped in chronic survival mode. What is often labeled as anxiety, burnout, or dysfunction is not evidence of a broken system, but evidence of a system that has been locked into a perpetual state of alarm due to constant stimulation, unresolved stress, and the absence of felt safety. The body, when deprived of stillness and coherence, does not fail. It adapts, and those adaptations, when prolonged, become symptoms. Ancient traditions did not view healing as something imposed upon the body, but as something that emerges when interference is removed and communication is restored. This understanding is now echoed in neuroscience, which shows that when the nervous system shifts out of fight or flight and into parasympathetic regulation, the body naturally initiates processes of repair, digestion, immune regulation, and emotional integration. The implication of this is profound because it reframes healing not as a battle against the body, but as a partnership with it, not as a heroic act of force, but as a disciplined act of listening. To frame this as mystical fantasy would be inaccurate because fantasy requires belief without evidence, whereas what is being described here is measurable, repeatable, and grounded in physiology. Heart rate variability, vagal tone, cortisol reduction. Inflammatory markers and neural coherence are not metaphors. They are biological facts, and they respond predictably to specific inputs such as breath, touch, posture, and attention. Ancient wisdom did not lack science. It lacked modern instruments, but it compensated through direct observation, embodied experimentation, and generational transmission of what consistently worked. The modern era, in contrast, developed instruments but gradually lost the capacity for internal perception, outsourcing regulation to external substances, devices, and systems, while dismissing the body's own intelligence as unreliable. This transmission exists to correct that imbalance, not by rejecting science, but by integrating it with embodied awareness. What you are being invited into is not a belief system, but a relationship. A renewed relationship with your own nervous system, your own physiology, and your own capacity for regulation. This is why the framing here is remembrance rather than discovery, because discovery suggests something external that must be acquired, while remembrance suggests something internal that must be reclaimed. You are not gaining a new power. You are recovering access to a power that has been dormant due to neglect, not absence. This shift in framing is essential because it restores sovereignty to the individual. Sovereignty does not mean denial of external support medicine or collective knowledge. It means the restoration of inner authority, the recognition that your internal state does not have to be dictated by external conditions. When you remember that your body contains built-in mechanisms for calming, repair, and clarity, You no longer approach life from a position of helplessness, constantly reacting to circumstances and seeking relief outside yourself. Instead, you begin to operate from a position of internal command where regulation precedes reaction and coherence precedes action. This is the foundation of true mastery, not dominance over the world, but governance of the self. Modern neuroscience increasingly confirms that perception, emotion, and cognition are inseparable from bodily state, meaning that clarity of thought and emotional resilience cannot be sustained in a dysregulated nervous system. Ancient traditions understood this intuitively, which is why breath posture, stillness, and ritual were central to their practices, not as spiritual theatrics, but as practical technologies for maintaining internal order. The tragedy of the modern age is not that these practices were forgotten, but that they were replaced with the belief that speed stimulation and constant productivity were sustainable. The body adapted as it always does by tightening bracing and remaining alert, and over time, this adaptation became normalized as the baseline state of existence. What is being reintroduced here is the understanding that this baseline is artificial, not natural, and that beneath it lies a state of calm alertness, clarity, and vitality that the body can access almost immediately when given the correct signal. This is not wishful thinking. It is observable in the rapid shifts that occur when the autonomic nervous system is guided into parasympathetic dominance. The breath slows, the heart rate stabilizes, muscle tension releases, and cognitive noise diminishes. Not because the mind has been convinced to relax, but because the body has been informed that it is safe. Safety is the prerequisite for healing, and safety is not established through logic or reassurance alone, but through physiological cues that the nervous system recognizes. This is why techniques that engage the body directly are so effective. They bypass the argumentative mind and speak the language of biology. The return to this understanding marks a shift away from external dependency toward internal mastery, not in a narcissistic sense, but in a deeply responsible one. When you recognize that you have the capacity to regulate your own state, you also recognize that you are responsible for how you inhabit your body, how you respond to stress, and how you care for your internal environment. This responsibility is not oppressive. It is liberating because it removes the illusion that peace is conditional upon external circumstances aligning perfectly. Peace becomes something you cultivate internally, not something you wait for externally. This does not mean that life becomes effortless or that challenges disappear, but it means that you meet those challenges from a regulated center rather than a reactive edge. Ancient wisdom framed this as mastery of the self, not in the sense of suppression, but in the sense of harmony, where mind and body operate as a unified system rather than competing forces. Modern neuroscience is now revealing the same truth in clinical terms, demonstrating that integration, not control, is the foundation of resilience. The invitation here is to step out of the narrative that you are at the mercy of your biology and into the realization that your biology is responsive to your awareness. This is not magical thinking. It is the practical application of how the nervous system functions. When you learn how to provide your body with signals of safety, coherence, and presence, it responds predictably because it was designed to. This realization shifts the axis of authority inward, away from endless seeking and toward embodied knowing. You are not being asked to believe anything, only to remember how to listen. And when you listen not with the intellect alone, but with the entire body, you rediscover that healing is not something you chase, but something that unfolds naturally when interference is removed. This is the foundation upon which everything that follows rests, the understanding that the body is not an enemy, not a problem, and not a machine, but a sovereign intelligence awaiting cooperation rather than conquest. Ok, mình sẽ làm đúng yêu cầu lần này. Tiếng Anh 3000 từ không cách, dòng rộng nghiêm. Phân tích, sinh học cộng cổ tri thức không thần bí, rẻ tiền không chia đoán. Dưới đây là một khối văn bản liền mạch. The modern worldview approaches the human body as if it were a mechanical object composed of separate parts, each functioning independently, and each vulnerable to malfunction, breakdown, or failure without constant external intervention. In this model, the body is treated like a machine that must be adjusted, repaired, or overridden by specialists, substances, or technologies whenever it deviates from an imposed standard of normality. Symptoms are isolated, categorized, and suppressed rather than interpreted. And the lived experience of the individual is often secondary to abstract measurements, diagnostic labels, and generalized protocols. This fragmentation did not arise from malice, but from a worldview that values control, predictability, and efficiency above relationship, responsiveness, and context. By reducing the body to mechanical components, modern systems gained remarkable power to intervene in acute crises, but they simultaneously lost the ability to perceive the body as an integrated, intelligent organism capable of self-regulation. In contrast, ancient systems of knowledge across cultures understood the body not as a machine, but as a living process, a dynamic field of communication in constant dialogue with its environment. These systems did not separate mind from body, emotion from physiology, or stress from illness, because they observed that such separations do not exist in lived reality. What modern language now calls the nervous system, endocrine signaling, immune modulation, and psychosomatic response was once understood as a unified intelligence, expressing balance or imbalance through sensation, emotion, and behavior. In these older frameworks, pain was not an error to be eliminated at all costs, but a message to be interpreted. Fatigue was not laziness, but a signal of depletion. And anxiety was not a defect, but an indication that the organism was perceiving threat or overload. This distinction is critical because it reframes stress, anxiety, and illness not as failures of the body, but as expressions of its intelligence attempting to adapt, protect, and survive under conditions that exceed its capacity. The modern tendency to override these signals through constant stimulation suppression or chemical management does not resolve the underlying imbalance. It merely silences the messenger, while the message intensifies beneath the surface. When a system designed to communicate through sensation is repeatedly ignored, it does not stop communicating. It escalates. This escalation is often what manifests as chronic illness, persistent anxiety, or unexplained fatigue. Not because the body is broken, but because it has exhausted gentler means of signaling distress. Ancient systems recognized this escalation pattern intuitively, which is why they emphasized early listening, subtle adjustment, and preventative regulation, rather than heroic intervention after collapse. Modern neuroscience is now arriving at the same conclusion through empirical observation, demonstrating that chronic stress fundamentally alters nervous system function, immune response, and hormonal balance, and that these alterations are not random but adaptive responses to perceived threat. The fight or flight response, once essential for survival, becomes pathological only when it is activated continuously without resolution. In this light, anxiety is not a psychological weakness, but a physiological state of unresolved mobilization, the body preparing for danger that never arrives or never ends. Illness, similarly, is not merely an invasion or malfunction, but often the cumulative result of prolonged dysregulation, where the systems responsible for repair, digestion, and immune defense are deprived of the conditions necessary to function optimally. The ancient understanding acknowledged that healing does not begin by attacking symptoms, but by restoring communication within the system. Communication is the foundation of regulation, and regulation is the foundation of health. When the body's signals are respected rather than overridden, the organism can recalibrate before breakdown occurs. This is why ancient practices emphasized breath rhythm, stillness, and awareness, not as spiritual embellishments, but as practical tools for reestablishing internal coherence. Breath, for example, was recognized as a bridge between conscious intention and autonomic function, long before science identified its role in vagal regulation and parasympathetic activation. Modern research now confirms that slow, intentional breathing directly influences heart rate variability, stress hormone release, and emotional stability, validating what was once known through observation and experience. The tragedy of the modern worldview is not that it is entirely wrong, but that it is incomplete. By focusing almost exclusively on external fixes, it conditions individuals to distrust their internal signals and defer authority to systems that cannot feel what the body feels. This creates a dependency loop in which the individual becomes increasingly disconnected from their own physiological intelligence, interpreting discomfort as an inconvenience rather than information. Over time, this disconnection erodes the capacity for self-regulation, making the individual more reliant on external interventions and less capable of responding adaptively to stress. Ancient systems avoided this trap by cultivating body literacy, the ability to recognize, interpret, and respond to internal states before they escalate into pathology. This literacy was not mystical. It was practical, honed through daily practices that maintained nervous system balance and emotional clarity. The modern dismissal of these practices as unscientific delayed their integration into mainstream understanding, but it did not invalidate their effectiveness. Neuroscience now demonstrates that the body's primary language is not words or concepts, but sensation, rhythm, and pattern. The nervous system communicates through changes in muscle tone, breath temperature, and visceral sensation, and these signals precede conscious thought. When individuals learn to recognize this language, they regain access to a form of intelligence that operates faster and more accurately than rational analysis alone. Healing in this context does not mean forcing the body into a predetermined state of health, but creating the internal conditions in which the body can do what it is designed to do. This requires a fundamental shift from domination to cooperation, from suppression to dialogue. Stress, anxiety, and illness then become guides rather than enemies, indicators of where attention rest or boundary adjustment is required. This does not romanticize suffering or suggest that pain should be endured unnecessarily. It acknowledges that pain has meaning and that ignoring it often compounds harm. Ancient systems taught that when the body is heard early, it rarely needs to scream later. Modern life, however, trains individuals to override early signals in the name of productivity, endurance, or social expectation, praising resilience while quietly penalizing sensitivity. The result is a population skilled at functioning while disconnected, capable of performance, but deprived of vitality. Neuroscience reveals that this state of chronic override keeps the nervous system locked in sympathetic dominance, reducing access to creativity, empathy, and long-term health. Healing begins when this override is interrupted not through force, but through attention. Attention is the act of listening without immediately fixing, judging, or suppressing. When attention is directed inward with curiosity rather than control, the nervous system receives a signal of safety, which is the prerequisite for regulation. Safety does not mean the absence of challenge. It means the presence of internal support. Ancient traditions encoded this understanding in rituals and practices that cultivated stillness, rhythm, and presence, ensuring that individuals regularly return to a regulated baseline. Modern neuroscience reframes these practices as methods for restoring autonomic balance, demonstrating that the same mechanisms are at work regardless of the language used to describe them. The body's native language is not pathology, but pattern, not diagnosis, but response. To speak this language is to notice tension before it becomes pain, restlessness before it becomes anxiety, and fatigue before it becomes illness. This skill cannot be outsourced. It must be embodied. External systems can support healing, but they cannot replace the individual's relationship with their own body. When that relationship is restored, healing becomes less about constant intervention and more about intelligent maintenance. The body reveals itself not as a fragile machine constantly on the verge of failure, but as a resilient organism capable of remarkable adaptation when given respect, time, and appropriate conditions. This perspective restores dignity to the human experience, affirming that symptoms are not betrayals but communications, and that health is not imposed from outside but cultivated from within. The shift required is not technological, but perceptual, a movement away from fragmentation toward integration. When we stop overriding the body's signals and begin learning its language, we do not lose control. We gain orientation. We become participants rather than managers, collaborators rather than commanders. In doing so, we align with a form of intelligence that has been operating quietly beneath our awareness all along, waiting not to be fixed, but to be heard. The precise anatomical location at the base of the skull, where the spine meets the cranium, is known in modern anatomy as the craniovertebral junction. Specifically, the articulation between the occipital bone of the skull and the first cervical vertebra, the atlas C1. This junction sits just inferior to the occipital protuberance nestled beneath the posterior rim of the skull, where the head balances atop the spinal column. It is not a vague region, but a tightly defined structural zone that includes the atlanto-occipital joint, the suboccipital muscles, the foramen magnum, and a dense network of nerves, blood vessels, and connective tissue. This area is one of the most neurologically and physiologically significant regions in the human body, as it forms the gateway between the brain and the spinal cord. Through this gateway, past the brainstem, vertebral arteries supplying blood to the brain, cerebrospinal fluid pathways, and critical autonomic nerves that regulate breathing, heart rate balance, and alertness. Any compression, tension, or dysregulation here has immediate systemic consequences, which is why both ancient traditions and modern medicine independently recognize this point as a site of exceptional importance. In traditional Chinese medicine, this exact location corresponds to the acupuncture point known as Feng Fu G16, commonly translated as the Wind Mansion or Palace of Wind. This name was not poetic abstraction, but a functional description based on empirical observation. In TCM, wind does not merely refer to meteorological air movement, but to any force characterized by sudden onset, changeability, movement, and invasion. Symptoms attributed to wind include dizziness, tremors, headaches, sudden pain, chills, stiffness, and neurological disturbances, all of which are commonly associated with dysfunction at the craniovertebral junction. The wind mansion was identified as a primary entrance point for external wind because of its exposed anatomical position and its proximity to the brain and spinal cord. This area is relatively unprotected by muscle compared to other regions, making it vulnerable to cold tension and injury. Ancient physicians observed that exposure to cold or sustained strain at the back of the neck often preceded illness, particularly disorders involving the head senses or nervous system. From this observation emerged the concept that wind enters the body through this gate, disrupting internal harmony. Importantly, the same point was also seen as a powerful site for restoration. By warming, mobilizing, or gently stimulating Feng Fu, practitioners could influence headaches, neck rigidity, vertigo, insomnia, and even emotional agitation. This dual role as both point of vulnerability and point of healing is central to why it was called a mansion or palace, a place where forces enter and exit, not a static symbol, but a functional gateway. Taoist internal cultivation systems extended this understanding further by recognizing the craniovertebral junction as a critical regulator of internal circulation and consciousness. In Taoist physiology, the body was mapped as an interconnected field of channels, fluids, and pressures rather than isolated organs. The base of the skull was understood as a convergence zone where upward and downward currents meet. Tension here was said to block the natural ascent of internal circulation and the descent of clear awareness, resulting in symptoms such as mental fog, emotional instability, and fatigue. Taoist texts frequently emphasize relaxing the neck, emptying the jade pillow, and allowing the head to float lightly atop the spine. These instructions are not mystical metaphors, but precise biomechanical cues. When the atlas is misaligned, or the suboccipital muscles are chronically contracted, blood flow through the vertebral arteries can be reduced. Cerebrospinal fluid dynamics can be altered, and vagal tone can be impaired. Modern research confirms that chronic tension in the suboccipital region is associated with headaches, autonomic dysregulation, and impaired proprioception. Taoist practitioners did not possess MRI scanners, but they observed the functional outcomes with remarkable accuracy. In embodied energy mapping systems, including later somatic traditions and modern integrative anatomy, this region is consistently identified as a primary interface between voluntary and involuntary control. The brainstem, which sits just above this junction, governs basic survival functions such as respiration, heart rhythm, and arousal. It is also the first structure to assess safety and threat. Because of this, the physical state of the craniovertebral junction has a direct impact on whether the nervous system remains in a state of vigilance or can settle into regulation. This is why gentle manual work, postural correction, or somatic awareness directed at this region often produces disproportionate effects throughout the body, including emotional release, changes in breathing, and shifts in mental clarity. The point's reputation as a gateway is therefore not symbolic, but anatomical. It is a literal bottleneck through which neurological signals, blood flow, and mechanical forces must pass. When this gateway is compressed or guarded by chronic tension, the entire system adapts around that restriction. When it is decompressed and allowed to align naturally, the system reorganizes toward efficiency and ease. Traditional Chinese medicine also associated the wind mansion with the governing vessel, a central channel that runs along the midline of the back and influences the brain spine and spirit. Stimulating GV16 was understood to clear the senses and stabilize the spirit language that aligns closely with modern descriptions of parasympathetic activation and improved cerebral perfusion. The fact that multiple independent traditions, separated by geography and language, identified the same anatomical point as a critical access site underscores that this knowledge emerged from embodied observation rather than belief. It is also significant that this point is accessible through posture, breath temperature, and touch, not only through needles or techniques. Simply allowing the head to balance naturally over the spine reduces compressive forces at the atlanto-occipital joint, improves neural signaling, and alters autonomic tone. This is why many contemplative practices emphasize upright posture with a relaxed neck regardless of cultural origin. The wind mansion is not an abstract chakra or imagined portal. It is a real physical location where structure and function intersect. Its importance arises from what passes through it and how sensitive those structures are to mechanical and thermal influence. When ancient physicians warned that wind enters here, they were describing a pattern of vulnerability that modern anatomy now explains in different terms. When they taught that healing could also enter here, they were recognizing that restoring alignment, warmth, and mobility at this junction has system-wide effects. Understanding this point today does not require adopting ancient cosmologies, but it does require acknowledging that the body has consistent access points where small changes produce large effects. The base of the skull, where the spine meets the cranium, is one such point, and its significance endures not because of symbolism, but because of anatomy, physiology, and lived human experience. Modern life is structured in a way that continuously activates the human nervous system's survival circuitry without providing adequate resolution or recovery. The fight or flight response, governed primarily by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, evolved to handle short bursts of acute danger, such as predators, physical threats, or sudden environmental changes. In these situations, the body mobilizes energy rapidly, heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow and fast, muscles tense, digestion slows, and attention narrows toward perceived threat. Once the danger passes, a healthy nervous system naturally shifts back into parasympathetic regulation, allowing the body to rest, repair, and integrate the experience. The problem with modern life is not stress itself, but the absence of completion. Instead of short, resolvable stressors, the nervous system is exposed to constant stimulation that mimics threat without allowing discharge. Notifications, deadlines, financial pressure, social, comparison, unresolved conflict, noise, artificial lighting, and information overload all act as low-grade stressors that keep the body on alert. None of these require physical escape or action, yet the nervous system responds as if they do. Over time, this creates a baseline state of vigilance that becomes normalized as just how life feels. Emotional suppression compounds this effect. Modern culture often rewards emotional control, productivity, and composure while discouraging the full expression of fear, grief, anger, or exhaustion. When emotional responses are repeatedly inhibited, the physiological activation associated with them has nowhere to go. The nervous system prepares for action, but the action never occurs. This incomplete stress response leaves residual activation in the body, particularly in muscles associated with protection and readiness. The neck stiffens to protect the head. The shoulders elevate to guard vital organs. The jaw clenches to suppress expression, and the upper back tightens to brace against anticipated impact. These patterns are not conscious choices, but automatic survival strategies. The nervous system learns that it is safer to stay tense than to risk vulnerability. Over time, this tension ceases to feel like effort and becomes posture. People begin to live inside a subtly contracted body without realizing it. Chronic sympathetic activation also disrupts the body's internal communication. Digestive issues, sleep disturbances, hormonal imbalance, and immune suppression often follow because the body remains prioritized for survival rather than maintenance. Neuroscience shows that when the nervous system is locked in fight or flight, the brain's threat detection centers dominate, while regions associated with reflection, empathy, and long-term planning become less accessible. This explains why chronic stress narrows perception and increases reactivity. It is not a failure of character, but a physiological state. Modern life rarely provides rituals of closure for stress. There is no shaking, running, crying, or communal processing built into daily routines. Stress accumulates silently. The nervous system adapts by maintaining readiness, assuming that the threat is ongoing. This adaptation is intelligent in the short term, but costly in the long term. Without intentional regulation, the body forgets how to return to rest. The individual may feel restless when still anxious, when quiet, or uncomfortable when nothing is happening. Calm begins to feel unsafe because the nervous system has learned to equate vigilance with survival. This is how modern life trains the body to remain in fight or flight, even in the absence of immediate danger. Chronic tension in the neck, shoulders, jaw, and upper back is not random stiffness or poor posture. It is the physical residue of unresolved survival responses. When the nervous system perceives threat, specific muscle groups activate automatically to protect vital structures. The neck and suboccipital regions stabilize the head and sensory organs. The jaw tightens to inhibit vocalization or aggression. The shoulders rise to shield the heart and lungs, and the upper back contracts to brace the torso. In a healthy stress cycle, these contractions release once safety is restored. In modern contexts, safety is rarely felt at the nervous system level, even when no external danger is present. As a result, these muscles remain partially engaged long after the original trigger has passed. This ongoing contraction becomes what somatic traditions refer to as frozen energy, not as a mystical substance, but as uncompleted physiological action. Energy in this sense refers to mobilized neural and muscular activation that was never discharged through movement, expression, or resolution. When an experience overwhelms the nervous system's capacity to process it, the body freezes. Freeze is not the absence of response, but the suspension of response. The nervous system immobilizes to survive, when neither fight nor flight feels possible. This immobilization often becomes embedded in muscle tone, connective tissue, and breathing patterns. The person may no longer remember the original event, but the body remembers the posture. The jaw remains tight, the shoulders remain elevated, the breath remains shallow. These patterns persist because the nervous system learned that release was unsafe. Over time, frozen survival postures shape identity. People describe themselves as tense, guarded, or rigid, without recognizing that these traits are embodied adaptations, not personality flaws. Neuroscience confirms that memory is not stored only in the brain, but distributed throughout the nervous system, including peripheral nerves and muscle tone. Unprocessed experiences are encoded as patterns of activation that influence perception and behavior long after the event. This is why certain situations provoke disproportionate reactions. The body is responding to stored information, not present reality. Frozen energy is maintained by avoidance. Because modern culture discourages deep rest, emotional expression, and somatic awareness, these stored patterns are rarely addressed. Stretching alone does not resolve them, because the nervous system must perceive safety before release occurs. Forcing relaxation can actually increase tension, because the body interprets it as another demand. Release happens when the nervous system is gently guided out of survival mode and into regulation. When safety is felt internally, the body begins to complete the interrupted stress responses. Muscles tremble, breath deepens, posture reorganizes, and emotional content may surface. This is not regression, but integration. The nervous system is finishing what it started. Understanding chronic tension as stored survival rather than defect changes the entire approach to healing. Instead of correcting posture from the outside, the focus shifts to restoring internal conditions that allow the body to let go. Frozen energy thaws when the nervous system learns that the present moment is safer than the past. This learning occurs through repeated experiences of regulated presence, not through intellectual insight alone. When tension releases, it often feels unfamiliar, even unsettling, because the body has identified contraction as normal. Over time, however, regulation becomes the new baseline. The body no longer needs to armor itself against life. It can respond flexibly rather than defensively. This is not a loss of strength, but a recovery of adaptability. When frozen energy dissolves, vitality returns, not because something was added, but because something was finally allowed to complete. The vagus nerve is the central communication highway of the parasympathetic nervous system and functions as one of the most powerful regulators of human physiology. Its role is not marginal or supplemental, but foundational. Without a properly functioning vagal system, the body cannot reliably exit survival mode, repair tissue, efficiently digest food, optimally regulate inflammation, or maintain emotional stability. The word vagus comes from the Latin term for wandering, and this name accurately reflects both its anatomy and its function. It is the longest cranial nerve in the human body, originating in the brainstem and extending downward through the neck into the chest and abdomen, branching into the heart, lungs, stomach, intestines, liver, pancreas, and other organs. This nerve does not merely transmit information in one direction. It operates bidirectionally, continuously, carrying data from the body to the brain and from the brain back to the body. Approximately 80% of vagal fibers are afferent, meaning they carry information upward from the organs to the brain. This means the brain is constantly being informed about the state of the body, and emotional and mental states are profoundly shaped by bodily signals long before conscious thought enters the picture. Functionally, the vagus nerve is the primary executor of the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the autonomic nervous system responsible for rest, digestion, repair, immune regulation, and recovery. While the sympathetic nervous system prepares the body for action by increasing heart rate, elevating blood pressure, tightening muscles, and mobilizing glucose, the parasympathetic system does the opposite. It slows, The heart deepens breathing, stimulates digestive secretions, enhances nutrient absorption, supports cellular repair, and down-regulates inflammatory responses. The vagus nerve acts as the command line through which these restorative processes are initiated and coordinated. When vagal tone is high, meaning the nerve is responsive and flexible, the body can shift smoothly between activation and relaxation. When vagal tone is low, the body becomes stuck in sympathetic dominance, leading to chronic stress, anxiety, fatigue, digestive disorders, immune dysfunction, and emotional instability. The vagus nerve's influence over the heart is particularly significant. It innervates the sinoatrial node, the heart's natural pacemaker, and exerts a braking effect on heart rate. This is why slow, deep breathing can rapidly reduce heart rate and induce calm. It stimulates vagal pathways that signal safety to the cardiovascular system. Heart rate variability, a widely used metric in neuroscience and cardiology, is largely a measure of vagal tone. Higher variability indicates a nervous system capable of adapting to changing demands, while low variability is associated with stress-related illness and reduced resilience. The vagus nerve also regulates lung function by controlling bronchoconstriction and bronchodilation, influencing the rhythm and depth of breathing. In the digestive system, it stimulates peristalsis enzyme release and gastric acid production, all of which are suppressed during stress. In the immune system, vagal signaling inhibits excessive inflammatory cytokine production through what is known as the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. This means that vagal activity literally tells the immune system when to stand down. At the neurological level, the vagus nerve interfaces directly with the brainstem, particularly the nucleus tractus solitarius and the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus. These structures act as integration centers where sensory information from the body is processed and translated into autonomic output. When the brainstem receives signals indicating safety, it shifts the entire nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance. This shift is not psychological suggestion. It is a biochemical event. Neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine are released, cortisol and adrenaline production decreases, and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis downregulates. Muscles soften, blood flow redistributes toward internal organs, and the body enters a state conducive to healing. Importantly, the vagus nerve does not require conscious belief to function. It responds to physical signals, mechanical stimulation, breath patterns, posture, and pressure applied at specific anatomical locations that interface with its pathways. One such location is the point commonly referred to in traditional Chinese medicine as governing vessel 16, also known as Feng Fu or wind mansion. Anatomically, this point is located at the base of the skull, in the midline, in the depression just below the occipital bone where the skull meets the cervical spine. This region lies directly above the brainstem and adjacent to critical neurovascular structures. It is not symbolic, metaphorical, or energetic in a vague sense. It is a real physical access point where external stimulation can influence internal autonomic regulation. From a neurological perspective, this area is densely innervated and closely connected to the vagal nuclei and other brainstem centers responsible for autonomic control. From an embodied perspective, it is a junction point where head spine and nervous system converge. Stimulating the governing vessel 16 point sends a clear signal to the brainstem that conditions have shifted toward safety. This signal can be delivered through gentle pressure, sustained touch, or combined touch and breath practices. The mechanism is straightforward. Mechanoreceptors and proprioceptors in the skin and connective tissue transmit sensory input through afferent nerve fibers to the brainstem. When this input is slow, rhythmic, and non-threatening, it biases the nervous system toward parasympathetic activation. The brainstem interprets this pattern as an indication that the environment is stable enough to permit downregulation of defense responses. In response, vagal output increases. Acetylcholine is released. Heart rate decreases. Breathing slows. Muscle tone reduces, and inflammatory signaling diminishes. This is why calm can arise within seconds of proper stimulation. It is not placebo, it is neural signaling. Traditional Chinese medicine described this point as the wind mansion because it was believed to be a primary entry point for external pathogenic influences, particularly wind, which in classical medicine symbolized sudden change, instability, and disruption. While the language differs, the functional understanding aligns with modern neuroscience. The upper cervical region is a sensitive interface between the external environment and the central nervous system. Cold exposure, abrupt movements, emotional shock, and chronic tension in this area can all dysregulate autonomic balance. Conversely, protecting and gently stimulating this region was understood as a way to restore equilibrium. Taoist practitioners recognized that congestion at this point led to mental fog, emotional agitation, insomnia, and fatigue, while opening it allowed vital energy to ascend, nourishing the brain and calming the spirit. Modern language translates this as improved vagal tone, increased cerebral blood flow, and enhanced nervous system regulation. What makes the governing vessel 16-point particularly powerful is its proximity to the brainstem, the most ancient and essential part of the brain. The brainstem does not respond to affirmations or rational arguments. It responds to sensory input. This is why practices that combine touch, breath, and stillness are so effective. When pressure at this point is synchronized with slow nasal inhalation, brief breath retention, and extended exhalation, the vagus nerve receives a multi-layered signal. Breath influences vagal tone through respiratory sinus arrhythmia. Pressure influences mechanosensory pathways, and stillness reduces competing sensory noise. Together, these inputs converge in the brainstem and amplify one another. The result is a rapid transition from sympathetic dominance to parasympathetic regulation. At a biochemical level, this transition involves measurable changes. Cortisol levels begin to fall, reducing the catabolic effects of chronic stress. Acetylcholine increases, promoting calm and anti-inflammatory effects. Nitric oxide production may rise, improving vascular function and oxygen delivery. The immune system shifts away from inflammatory readiness and toward repair. Digestive activity resumes. Neural oscillations in the brain shift towards slower, more coherent patterns associated with calm awareness. These changes are not abstract. They can be observed through heart rate variability, cortisol assays, and neuroimaging. What ancient traditions described as energy flow and restoration, modern science describes as autonomic regulation and neurochemical balance. The language differs, but the phenomenon is the same. Understanding the vagus nerve as the master regulator reframes the entire concept of healing. Healing is no longer something imposed from the outside through force or intervention, but something initiated from within by restoring the body's capacity to self-regulate. When the vagus nerve is functioning optimally, the body knows how to heal. Cells replicate accurately, tissues repair efficiently, immune responses resolve appropriately, and emotional states stabilize naturally. Anxiety, chronic pain, digestive disorders, and fatigue are not signs of a broken system, but indicators of a system stuck in defense. By stimulating the governing vessel, 16-point, and supporting vagal tone, we are not adding anything foreign to the body. We are reminding the nervous system of a state it already knows. This perspective also restores sovereignty. Instead of depending exclusively on external fixes, individuals learn to influence their internal state directly. This does not reject medicine or therapy, but complements them by addressing the foundational regulatory system that underlies all physiological function. The vagus nerve becomes a bridge between ancient embodied wisdom and modern neuroscience, demonstrating that the body has always possessed mechanisms for self-healing. These mechanisms were never lost. They were simply overshadowed by a worldview that prioritized control over regulation and suppression over listening. When we learn how to speak the body's native language through breath, touch, and awareness, the nervous system responds immediately. Safety is restored, and from safety, healing naturally unfolds. The three-stage activation sequence is not a technique of force willpower or mechanical effort. It is a protocol of synchronization designed to speak directly to the nervous system in its own native language. The body does not respond to aggression with healing. It responds to coherence with regulation. This sequence works precisely because it aligns three fundamental channels of communication at once: touch, breath, and awareness. Individually, each of these inputs has a mild regulatory effect. When synchronized, they form a clear, unmistakable command to the nervous system that conditions have shifted from threat to safety. The first stage of the sequence is inhalation combined with gentle, deliberate pressure. As the breath enters through the nose, slow and unforced, the lungs expand and the diaphragm descends. This alone already begins to bias the nervous system toward parasympathetic activity because nasal breathing stimulates vagal afferents and lengthens the respiratory cycle. At the same time, light but intentional pressure is applied to the activation point at the base of the skull. The pressure is not meant to penetrate deeply or manipulate tissue. It is meant to be steady, present, and focused. Mechanoreceptors in the skin and fascia respond not to intensity, but to clarity and consistency. When pressure is synchronized with inhalation, the nervous system receives a compound signal. Air is entering smoothly, and contact is stable and non-threatening. This combination begins to interrupt the habitual pattern of shallow breathing and muscular guarding that characterizes fight or flight mode. The inhalation phase establishes engagement. It tells the system, attention is here. The second stage is breath retention with sustained contact. This is the most misunderstood and most critical phase of the sequence. Breath retention is not breath holding in the sense of strain or deprivation. It is a brief, comfortable pause at the top of the inhale, usually lasting only a few seconds, during which pressure remains constant. In this pause, something important happens neurologically. The nervous system enters a moment of heightened signal clarity. Without the movement of air, in or out, sensory noise decreases. The sustained contact at the activation point continues to send afferent input to the brainstem, and the absence of respiratory motion allows that signal to be registered more distinctly. From a brainstem perspective, this combination indicates stability. Nothing is rushing. Nothing is escaping. Nothing is preparing to strike. This is the window in which the nervous system updates its threat assessment. If the pressure is gentle and the pause is comfortable, the update resolves toward safety. This is why force breaks the sequence. Excess pressure or strained breath retention introduces threat cues which cancel the effect. The goal is not intensity, but alignment. Awareness during this phase is crucial. Awareness does not mean visualization or mental effort. It means simply knowing where you are touching and knowing that you are breathing. When awareness rests in the body rather than racing ahead in thought, the nervous system receives congruent information from multiple channels. Touch says here. Breath says slow. Awareness says present. Together they form a unified message that the brainstem cannot ignore. The third stage is slow exhalation with release. As the breath leaves the body, preferably through the mouth in a long, controlled stream, pressure is gradually reduced and released. This synchronized release is not accidental. It is instructional. Exhalation is the phase most strongly associated with parasympathetic dominance. Heart rate naturally slows during the outbreath and vagal activity increases. When the physical release of pressure mirrors the emptying of the lungs, the nervous system receives a powerful cue of completion. Something that was engaged is now safely letting go. Muscles follow this cue automatically. Tone decreases in the neck, jaw, shoulders, and upper back. The biochemical cascade initiated in the earlier stages now accelerates. Acetylcholine release increases. cortisol output decreases. Blood flow redistributes toward the organs of digestion and repair. The internal state shifts not gradually over hours, but perceptibly within minutes. This is why the sequence works as a command rather than a suggestion. The nervous system does not debate sensory input. It responds to patterns. When touch, breath, and awareness are synchronized, they form a pattern that has only one logical interpretation. The environment is safe enough to stand down. Importantly, this sequence does not rely on belief. A skeptical nervous system still responds because the inputs bypass the cognitive centers that generate doubt. The brainstem does not require faith, it requires data. This is also why repetition strengthens the effect. Each cycle reinforces the neural pathway that associates these inputs with safety. Over time, the system learns that calm is accessible and does not require collapse or exhaustion. The action becomes more efficient, the response faster. Eventually, even light contact or a single slow breath can initiate the shift, because the pathway has been conditioned through repetition. The elegance of the three-stage sequence lies in its restraint. Nothing is forced. Nothing is added. There is no attempt to overpower stress or suppress sensation. Instead, the body is given coherent information and allowed to reorganize itself. This is the opposite of how modern life trains the nervous system, which relies on stimulation, distraction, and pressure to function. Here, regulation arises from simplicity and timing. When inhalation engages, retention clarifies, and exhalation releases, the nervous system completes a full regulatory loop. That loop is the biological basis of calm. Within minutes, breathing deepens on its own. Thoughts slow without effort. The sense of being on edge dissolves, not because the world has changed, but because the internal command center has updated its status. This is not relaxation as collapse. It is regulation as restoration. The body does not shut down, it recalibrates. And because this sequence speaks directly to the systems that govern survival, its effects ripple outward, influencing emotion, cognition, digestion, immunity, and perception. What appears to be a simple action is in fact a precise conversation with the nervous system. When spoken fluently, the body listens immediately. During activation, the body is not entering a vague state of relaxation or an imagined calm created by suggestion. It is undergoing a specific, measurable biological shift, driven by the autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic branch mediated by the vagus nerve. When the activation sequence is engaged correctly, sensory input from touch, breath, and awareness converges at the brainstem, especially the nucleus tractus solitarius, which acts as a central relay for visceral information. One of the earliest biochemical events that occurs is the release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the primary neurotransmitter of the parasympathetic nervous system, and its role is fundamentally different from that of adrenaline or cortisol. Instead of mobilizing energy for survival, acetylcholine signals restoration, repair, and conservation. As acetylcholine levels rise, it binds to receptors in the heart, lungs, digestive tract, and immune system, initiating a cascade of calming and regulatory effects. In the heart, acetylcholine acts directly on the sinoatrial node, the heart's natural pacemaker, slowing the rate of electrical firing. This results in heart rate deceleration, not through force, but through inhibition. The heart does not relax because it is tired. It slows because it is receiving a clear signal that vigilance is no longer required. This deceleration is often accompanied by increased heart rate variability, a key marker of autonomic flexibility and health. Higher heart rate variability indicates that the heart can rapidly adapt to changing demands, accelerating when needed, and decelerating when safety is restored. This adaptability is a hallmark of resilience, not weakness. Simultaneously, acetylcholine exerts a powerful anti-inflammatory effect through what is known as the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. Immune cells, including macrophages, have acetylcholine receptors. When these receptors are activated, the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines such as tumor necrosis, factor alpha, and interleukin-6 is reduced. This means that the body actively downregulates inflammation at a systemic level. Chronic stress is known to keep inflammatory pathways switched on, contributing to pain, autoimmune activity, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegeneration. Activation reverses this signal. The reduction in inflammation is not symbolic. It can be measured through changes in cytokine levels, C-reactive protein, and other biomarkers. At the same time, cortisol regulation begins to shift. Cortisol is not inherently harmful. It is essential for energy mobilization and alertness. The problem arises when cortisol remains elevated due to persistent threat signaling. During activation, as parasympathetic dominance increases, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis receives inhibitory feedback. The hypothalamus reduces its release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which in turn decreases adrenocorticotropic hormone output from the pituitary, leading to a gradual normalization of cortisol levels from the adrenal glands. This process does not happen instantaneously, but the direction of change is clear and reliable. Over repeated activations. Baseline cortisol levels often decrease and diurnal rhythms normalize, meaning cortisol rises appropriately in the morning and falls in the evening. This normalization improves sleep, immune function, metabolic regulation, and emotional stability. Another critical biological process occurring during activation is the shift in respiratory chemistry. Slow, controlled exhalation increases carbon dioxide tolerance, which stabilizes blood pH and improves oxygen delivery to tissues through the Bohr effect. This enhances cellular metabolism and reduces the sensation of air hunger or panic that often accompanies dysregulated breathing. As breathing slows and deepens naturally, afferent vagal signals increase, further reinforcing parasympathetic dominance. This creates a self-amplifying loop in which calm physiology begets calmer physiology. Central to understanding why repeated activation strengthens resilience is the concept of vagal tone. Vagal tone refers to the functional capacity of the vagus nerve to rapidly regulate physiological state. It is not a static trait, but a trainable one. High vagal tone is associated with emotional regulation, social engagement, digestive efficiency, cardiovascular health, and stress recovery. Low vagal tone is associated with anxiety, depression, inflammation, and poor stress tolerance. Each time the activation sequence is performed, the vagus nerve is exercised in the same way a muscle is strengthened through use. Neural pathways involved in parasympathetic regulation become more efficient, synaptic connections strengthen, and the threshold for triggering a calming response lowers. Over time, the body no longer requires intense or prolonged stimulation to shift states. Small cues become sufficient. This is why people who practice activation regularly often report that they recover from stress more quickly, experience emotions without being overwhelmed, and maintain clarity under pressure. Importantly, this form of resilience does not suppress emotion, it contains it. Emotional regulation does not mean the absence of feeling, but the capacity to experience feeling without being hijacked by it. From a neuroscientific perspective, increased vagal tone enhances communication between the prefrontal cortex and limbic structures such as the amygdala. This top-down modulation allows emotional responses to be contextualized rather than reflexive. Fear signals are evaluated rather than automatically acted upon. The calm experienced during activation is therefore not imagined, placebo-driven, or dependent on belief. It is reflected in measurable changes. Slower heart rate increased. Heart rate variability reduced. Inflammatory markers normalized. cortisol, rhythms, improved digestion, and altered brainwave patterns associated with relaxed alertness. Functional MRI and EEG studies consistently show increased coherence and reduced hyperactivation in stress-related neural circuits when parasympathetic dominance is restored. Subjectively, this is felt as steadiness, clarity, and a sense of internal space. Objectively, it is a shift in biochemical and neural activity that can be quantified. This distinction matters because it reclaims calm as a biological skill rather than a psychological trick. The body is not being convinced to feel safe. It is being shown safety through precise sensory input. Once shown, it responds automatically. Repetition does not dull the effect. It deepens it because the nervous system learns through experience, not instruction. Over time, the baseline state shifts. What once required deliberate activation becomes the default. Stress still occurs, but it no longer dominates. Recovery becomes faster, more complete, and less effortful. This is the essence of physiological resilience, not the avoidance of challenge, but the ability to return to regulation after challenge has passed. In this sense, activation is not an escape from reality, but a recalibration of the internal systems that interpret reality. The calm that follows is not a story the mind tells itself. It is the body remembering how to function when it is no longer bracing for impact. Across human history, cultures that never contacted one another still described the same invisible yet tangible phenomenon animating life. In China, it was called qi; in India, prana; in Japan, ki; in ancient Greece, pneuma. Different languages, different metaphors, but the same recognition. There is a fundamental organizing energy that moves through the body, governs vitality, and bridges physiology with consciousness. This life force energy was never described as mystical vapor or abstract belief. It was observed through direct experience of health, aliveness, clarity, and coherence. When it flowed freely, the body healed faster, the mind stayed clear, emotions moved without stagnation, and action felt effortless. When it was blocked, fatigue, confusion, tension, illness, and emotional rigidity followed. Modern culture largely discarded this language not because it was disproven, but because it could not be easily reduced to mechanical parts. Yet modern neuroscience and physiology are now circling back to the same truth through different terms: bioelectrical signaling, fascial conductivity, neurovascular coupling, autonomic regulation. Life force was never superstition. It was an early map of an intelligent system science is only now learning to measure. Stress is the primary disruptor of this system. Stress is not merely a psychological experience. It is a full-body contraction pattern. When stress is perceived, the nervous system shifts into survival mode, prioritizing immediate threat response over long-term regulation. Blood flow changes, breathing becomes shallow, muscles brace, and attention narrows. Over time, when stress is chronic, this survival posture becomes habitual. Energy that once circulated through the body becomes localized and trapped. In Chinese medicine, this is described as qi stagnation. In yogic systems, it is described as blocked prana. In modern terms, it appears as reduced vagal tone, restricted fascial glide, impaired lymphatic flow, and altered bioelectrical signaling between tissues. These descriptions are not contradictory. They are different lenses observing the same phenomenon. When the body is locked in survival, life force does not disappear, but its movement becomes restricted. Like water trapped behind a dam, energy builds pressure in some areas while leaving others depleted. This is why stress can produce simultaneous symptoms of tension and exhaustion, agitation and numbness, hyperactivity and collapse. Activation of specific regulatory points in the body was understood by ancient systems as a way to reopen circulation. These points were not chosen arbitrarily. They are locations where nerves, blood vessels, connective tissue planes, and sensory receptors converge. When stimulated gently and intentionally, they send a signal of safety and coherence to the nervous system. This signal allows the body to exit survival mode and re-enter a state of regulation. As regulation returns, life force energy resumes its natural circulation. This is not energy being added from outside. It is energy being redistributed from defensive holding patterns back into global flow. The governing vessel points described in Taoist and Chinese medicine were seen as master switches because they influenced the entire axis of the body. When these points were activated, practitioners observed changes in breath posture, mental clarity, and emotional state within minutes. What is often misunderstood is the nature of the calm that follows. Calm, in this context, is not sedation, dullness, or shutdown. It is the absence of unnecessary resistance. When life force circulation is restored, the body no longer wastes energy bracing against imagined or remembered threats. The paradoxical result is that people feel calmer and more energized at the same time. This seems contradictory only if calm is equated with low energy. In reality, calm is the removal of friction. When friction decreases, available energy increases. This is why, after proper activation, people report a quiet mind paired with heightened alertness, relaxed muscles, paired with lightness, emotional steadiness, paired with creativity. Presence becomes easier because attention is no longer fragmented by internal alarms. Creativity emerges because the nervous system is no longer preoccupied with protection. This form of energy is fundamentally different from stimulant-based energy. Stimulants work by forcing the body into mobilization, regardless of underlying state. Caffeine, adrenaline, and stress hormones override fatigue signals and push the system into output. This can create temporary focus and drive, but it is borrowed energy. The cost is paid later through crashes, irritability, anxiety, sleep disruption, and deeper depletion. Stimulant energy is loud, narrow, and unsustainable. Life force energy, by contrast, is quiet, expansive, and renewable. It does not spike and crash because it is not extracted through force. It arises naturally when circulation is restored. This is why traditions emphasized practices that appeared gentle on the surface: breath regulation, subtle touch posture, alignment, stillness. They understood that force interrupts flow, while synchronization restores it. When activation reopens circulation at a regulatory point, the nervous system interprets this as safety at a foundational level. Safety is the prerequisite for flow. Once safety is restored, the body reallocates resources from defense to repair, from vigilance to exploration, from contraction to expression. Energy that was previously consumed by guarding is freed for living. This is experienced subjectively as clarity motivation, without anxiety, and engagement without exhaustion. Over time, repeated activation trains the system to maintain this state more consistently. The body learns that it does not need to remain armored to survive. This learning is somatic, not intellectual. It happens below thought. As circulation improves, emotional patterns also shift. Emotions are not separate from energy. They are movements of it. When energy is blocked, emotions stagnate. When flow resumes, emotions regain mobility. This is why people often report emotional release or insight during or after activation without deliberate psychological processing. The system is simply regaining its capacity to move information through itself. Presence deepens because the mind no longer needs to escape discomfort. Creativity arises because novelty is no longer perceived as threat. The ancient insight was simple and profound: life force flows where attention, breath, and relaxation align. Stress disrupts this alignment. Activation restores it. The result is not passivity, but a form of strength that does not strain. It is the strength of a system operating at coherence rather than at war with itself. This is why those traditions emphasized mastery from within, rather than dependency on external stimulation. They were not rejecting tools, They were prioritizing sovereignty. When life force circulates freely, the body becomes its own source of energy, clarity, and regulation. Calm and vitality cease to be opposites. They become two expressions of the same underlying state, a system at home in itself.